Welcome back to Drive Driver Driven. I'm Humble and we're in the MK. Back in the garage today. It is miserable outside. It is chucking it down pretty good, raining off and on, despite the clear weather we've had in the past week, believe it or not. I wanted to go around a couple things on the car. If all goes well, we'll actually get the engine and transmission in the car. But before that can happen, I need to show you a couple of steps on my setup that you'll need to perform if you're using the same or similar parts. So let me get out of here and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Yeah, still coming down pretty good. Don't feel bad for the Ultima. It's relatively waterproof. The poor MK, not so much. I checked on it after last night's storms and you can see there's pooling water on top of the cover, which itself is not exactly waterproof. And there was a little bit of standing water inside, so I'm gonna have to figure that out. I'll probably end up pulling it back into the garage next time we have some storms. So as you can see, I've pulled the welder out, but that's not for me to use because I can't use it without getting shocked to hell. I've got my friend Sean coming over and he's gonna help me with item number one, which is our engine mount plate. Now I've shown in the past how on this side of the engine, the K24 and the K20 have a different bolt pattern. But on the exhaust side, the pattern is the same. So this side lines up, but the intake side does not. This is also the exhaust that MK provides. I have my doubts that it's actually going to line up with the hole that I put in the bodywork on first inspection, but we'll see. We'll see how that plays out. This isn't going to be the final iteration, though. I'm going to use this to get the car through its first ref inspection, but I have let's say the real exhaust is going to be planned out by the folks over at Burns Stainless and then fabricated by someone locally so that we can really maximize the breathability on this particular setup. While this will work, it's probably robbing us of 20 to 30 horsepower because of mostly this collector design. Like, this is adequate in that it gets the exhaust out, but it is not scavenging, it's not a merged collector, and it could be designed significantly better. So that's what we're gonna do, is we're gonna optimize the size of our primaries, we're gonna optimize the location of our collector. It will go into an expansion chamber and then out through the rest of the system in a high flow muffler and down the side of the car. But that's for a later date. For now, we're going to use this because it'll just get us out the door. It'll get us to our first inspections, and I'm not really worried about its performance initially, and I'm not even going to dyno tune it until we get the new exhaust built. But back onto this side. So I have this plate, as you can see. I've got a couple of cardboard templates. So this was our version 1 CAD or cardboard aided design. Really the first step is to eat a ton of cereal, and then you have an empty box. Use that box, cut off some pieces, and do a couple of iterations. So this was kind of close, but I wasn't really happy with how that little corner stuck out, and it didn't really look like it was doing much. So then it came on to V2. V2 is a little bit happier. It's got a little more material around that right-hand mount, and I was a lot happier with this. And then when it came to the steel bit, I left yet even more material up here and just clearance where I needed to get around this, and left a little more meat down here. Yeah, that'll make it heavier, and yeah, I could drill out the middle of this to make it a little bit lighter or smooth it out, but we need to position this mount accurately to set both the angle of the motor as it sits in the car, which sets the height of our valve cover, but also this beautiful piece, which this is a 60 millimeter Kinsler / Drag Cartel throttle body setup for the K24 or K20 engines. I'll detail the engine itself a little more on top of the video that Mike Kojima put together from Moto IQ. But the ITB setup, it seems like it's big on its face. I mean, these are some giant throttle bodies, but they go bigger. They go up to like 76 or 78 millimeters in size. And full-on drag motors, NA builds can utilize a throttle body of that size. But to say that it's peaky is a bit of a misnomer. It's basically everything at the top, whereas this build is something that I wanted to have a big, fat torque band right in the middle of the power range so that it was a great track and autocross motor. So that's sort of what I was aiming at. There's a couple of concerns I have. So if you look at the engine this way, you can see how the throttle bodies are almost level with the top of the engine depending on what angle the engine sits at. And so what I might try to do is in the car, make it lean back a little bit as much as we can to get some clearance for the hood. But we may have to cut a hole in the hood because despite having the ITBs here, we still need to make room for a whole filter assembly that needs to go on top of that. So in the end, we may end up just cutting a hole in the hood for that. And it's not a bad look, but I was preferring to keep everything under the hood, but we'll see. We'll see how it turns out. So on my particular setup, we have this adapter plate from K-Power. It's their flywheel and pressure plate assembly, supplied clutch as well. And another part that I ordered from them is a hydraulic throwout bearing. So this is an annular hydraulic throwout bearing setup. I did swap the lines out. So these are the provided lines, which I was unsure if they would actually make it to the new location, which I've got here in the MK. This setup is for a Miata, and in fact, this is the old throwout bearing mount for the Miata. You pull this piece off to bolt that one on. And they also supply these lines, which will work in a Miata setup, but this isn't strictly a Miata. Things are slightly different. So I ended up making some new lines. This one's not terminated yet, so I can run it to the exact length I need. And then for our bleeder line, I didn't want the lines to mismatch, so I just remade it, or a black coated PTFE line so that the lines match, because that's how I'd roll. And everything's bolted up in here and ready to go. The trick, though, is there is a set depth on this annular hydraulic bearing, and this is basically your slave cylinder and throwout bearing all in one unit, and it sits at a certain depth, and you need to measure to make sure that that depth will work on your clutch setup on this side. And it comes with instructions to sort of educate you on the measurements you need to take to verify your fit. All right, so I'm gonna do my best here. So we have our alignment tool that was all set. We'll set that aside. And what the instructions tell you to do is to take a depth measurement. And what you're gonna measure is the clutch springs here down to your throwout bearing. And that's to verify that the depth of these clutch springs here is not too shallow or not sticking out too far. And the easiest way to do it is to grab yourself a flat edge This isn't a great one, but this will do for demonstration purposes. And we are just going to lay it against our clutch fingers. And then we're going to use the depth part of our calipers. Close it up to that gap. And that's our reading. And I've gone through and done all the measurements, and what I was getting was about 1 inch and 850 for the depth all around the springs. Once you have that measurement, you're going to take your flat edge, whatever you use. So in this case, we got our little Worth razor, and it's about 0.150, so that makes our measurement really easy to figure out. It's 1.7, give or take 0.005 of an inch for fudge factor. And if we look at our paperwork, on the paperwork it gives you height to the straight edge, the thickness of the straight edge, and then your clutch finger height is when you subtract those two. I didn't fill this out, but what this is informing you is that you need a measurement that sits between 1.78 and 1.65. And we ended up at 1.7, give or take 5 thousandths. And that is almost dead nuts right in the middle of those two. So having verified that measurement, we are all good to bolt the transmission onto the engine and get that placed in the car. So that's just something that I wanted to point out for folks that are using that type of annular hydraulic bearing, because you need to verify all this before bolting it all together, because if it doesn't stick out, if your hydraulic throwout bearing doesn't stick out enough, well, you'll never get full disengagement of the clutch spring. And if it sticks out too far, what'll happen is you'll never have full engagement of the clutch face, which means that it'll just slip or it won't hold the amount of power that it's rated to because it's not got the full clamp load. That's all stuff that you have to verify before you just slam things together. A couple other bits I want to just point out now while we're here, because some of this has to come back off again. I have this rear coolant plate from K-Power. This will help route our coolant down underneath our intake. I decided to go with an AN20 setup. Again, elevating the build. This is unnecessary. You could just use whatever, but I want it to look good. That's going to go up and forward to our upper radiator mount. And we'll sort out all that plumbing later once we get the engine in the car. Again, today's goal is to try and get this in the car today, and then we can really start on plumbing and wiring. Addressing sort of the elephant in the room, it's on the ground, it's on its wheels, just to make it a bit of a roller to free up some more room in the back here where I had the tires piled up. And sort a couple other things out with the suspension. I decided to make the car a roller, so we have the corners on, we have the suspension torqued down, but the alignment really isn't set, which is obvious when you start pushing the car around. We have the headlights on, we have the headlight brackets on, which is a little bit of a bear when you first put them on. Lining up this bracket on both sides, getting all the holes aligned, plus getting the bolts in place, plus getting these spacers in place is a pain, and I'm not looking forward to having to align the car and change the position of these rose joints, because that'll mean pulling everything off and sorting it out again. But I will say, once you get it on there once, it is a little bit easier the second and third time. I know this is sort of turning into a point and talk, but I'm trying to think of all the kind of rapid fire progress that we've made. Of course, the panel sides are on, all that's dry. I've put this kind of blue protective film on it, again, to just try and protect the sides from scratches and stuff during the rest of assembly. I'll end up doing the same for the top here, but I still have to outfit it with our wiper assembly and all of that. more and more wiring stuff is collecting in the car. For this, I'm doing a sort of a highlight of Haltech's suite of products. Again, they aren't sponsoring the build, although I really wish they did, because I would save a bit of money. But the goal is to try and get as much of the Haltech boxes up here under the dash and branch everything out through the rest of the car. But so far we have our PDM, we have 1500 ECU, there's a CAN bus expansion, there's another CAN bus expansion, I did the TPMS 4-channel, there's the EGT 8-channel system, although we're only using 4 of that. I have the dash setup, a whole suite of sensors. I wanted to use as many of their sensors to hopefully ease the use of software and configuration and programming, all that stuff. So down here on our pedal assembly, I have their brake pressure sensors and then a simple clutch switch on the clutch that we can use in the software later for things like quick restart or launch control or things like that. And I also did the IC7 dash, and like the Ultima, I decided to go with the Summit steering wheel buttons for the MK. Some of this was sorting out wiring and kind of hurrying and humming about which direction I wanted to go. Kind of sucks because I already started to buy things that I was going to use for wiring and ended up changing direction a couple of times before deciding on a final sort of setup. But some of that was the process of discovery, trying to figure out what the Haltech could and could not do. Some of it was the limitation of the number of circuits that the Haltech provided. And some of that is just that certain things just didn't fit with the Miata setup. So you can see that I've removed the whole stock and steering wheel lock assembly, which will greatly simplify the whole area of the dash around here. I went with the IC7 Haltech dash, which will basically take up the whole center of the dash area here. And that's really the only dash that I need. I've been on the fence about also using the small round smart gauge that I got from Haltech and potentially putting it here and dedicating that to fuel or something else that I want to keep an eye on. We'll see how that turns out. I may just put a phone mount or something up here that's within easy reach. And then likewise, I have a CAN pad, just an 8-button CAN pad that will mount somewhere up on the dash or on the center console area to control or use as inputs, etc., besides the steering wheel buttons that we're going to have. So that's a lot to go through. But again, once we get the drivetrain in the car, we can start sorting that out. Now, speaking of wiring and plumbing, fuel system is also on the short list. Because we're using the K24, we can run this as a deadhead, which is to say the regulator, the filter, everything can live back here in the back of the car, and then we just run a single fuel line all the way to the front, to the engine, and then it just deadheads. It stops at the fuel rail, and then it's just one fuel line that runs all the way to the front. No need for a second one. That's okay to run that setup for an NA engine. You're really not going to have too many fueling issues with a setup like that. If I were doing a turbo or anything really crazy, I would do a full loop just to make sure that we had fuel cycling all the way back and forward. I still might change my mind on this and end up running 2 fuel lines with a return circuit all the way back. I haven't really committed. It just depends on how much room we have in the tunnel for additional fuel lines, plus wiring, plus drive shaft, plus transmission, yada, yada, yada. There's a lot to put in there. So if we can get away with 1 fuel line, great. If we have to run 2, it's not the end of the world, but I do want to end up running our fuel pressure regulator and our filter in the back here because our pump is internal to the tank. So we have a vent, a fuel feed, and a fuel return all right here. And then on this guy, you can see we have our fuel pressure and temperature sensor. And then for a location for this guy, I want to get it back here but out of the way. So, you know, something like this or something on the side here. Somewhere where it makes sense that we can just feed into the filter and then out of this, back down and out of the car. Some kind of orientation where all that makes sense, and we still have room for our kind of mini trunk tub assembly to fit as well. So it'll take a little bit of figuring out to get that sorted, but it's not too heady a job. Another item, if you've been paying attention, is the rear diff assembly has changed color. And that's because off camera, I went through and I rebuilt the diff assembly. The diff that was in there was in fact missing the pinion spacer, so the pinion depth was wrong. I bought another one, went through the whole assembly process. It had the shim. I set everything up again, verified it, set everything that it needed to be set, and then put the whole diff assembly and carrier assembly together. And then actually before that, I gave it a quick paint job with some Steel It, which might as well be the official color of SEMA, but it does actually turn out a nice finish. I wish I waited a little bit longer before I put it in the car because it hadn't quite cured all the way, but a little bit of touch up here and there with a Sharpie, can't even tell. So the diff is in, that's all bolted down. I wanted to change these diff bushings out, and I had another set of black bushings. However, if you look down here, so this puts the diff housing right up against the chassis, and because this depth is 0, there's no room for anything in between, that makes it so our little plate here, our reinforcement plate, can sit down on the chassis here, and then it sets our pinion angle here, and it sets our speedo pickup on the axle and such there. The diff bushings I had an extra little space underneath, and because of that, it raised the whole assembly about 1/4 inch, so nothing else was lining up. And besides that, there's also this mount on this side, which mounts directly to the chassis underneath. So rather than screw up everything else, I went back to these orange mounts, which I'm not really a fan of because aesthetically it bothers me, but it is what it is. No one's going to be able to see it with the trunk cover on anyway, but you all know it's there, I know it's there, and just know that it bothers me too. One more last little update is while I was working with the steering, I decided to change to an OMP wheel, which I think is 300 mil, which I thought was going to be big enough, and I may end up upgrading again to a 320 or a 350. This was the wheel provided, which I think is like a 270 or something like that. I honestly thought that this was going to end up much bigger in my hands, and we'll see. I'm going to drive it with the OMP wheel, see how it fits with the seats, the interior, everything else. But keep in mind, this may or may not end up being the final steering wheel. I may go a little bigger. I believe this is the same diameter that I have in the Ultima. The wheel that's actually in the MK is a little bit larger. I want to say that's using a 320 steering wheel. And like all things, I'm just trying to find the happy medium. And if anyone's got an MK and they've changed their steering wheel from the STR unit provided, let me know how big of a wheel you're using in the comments, and if you're running into any kind of interference problems with potentially the roll cage, which will be over in this area, or the doors or the side or anything else that will be bolting onto the car. I don't have any of that on right now, so I'm kind of wary of going bigger without actually driving it and and trying all that stuff first. So yeah, if you're running something larger, let me know, and let me know if you have any kind of clearance issues. All right, jumping out of the time lapse, you saw us struggling a little bit. Some of that's my own making, and some of that's just tight tolerances in the MK kit with the K-miata setup. So first off, my issue that I caused is looking down here, we can see that the very front cover on our dry sump setup doesn't clear this front rail. It looks close in video, but it won't actually clear if we attempt to drop this mount in place. Like even swinging it over a little bit, you can see it's just not enough up there. So this mount, just like the other side, I think I'm gonna have to end up remaking it. I think if this was a normal K20 install, this mount would be just fine. And using the oil pan that MK supplies, I think there's enough clearance on this front rail here. But as for me, I've already marked the chassis because what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to chop this bar out and put it in, basically move it forward so it lines up with these black marks on either side. So either A, I'll cut this bar shorter and just move it forward an inch, or B, I'll replace it with some square stock and just make it fit. So either of those is a good option. It's not the end of the world. It's easy enough to do, but it's a good afternoon project. The other issue was the brake line setup, how it was routed. Basically got crunched by the dry sump when we lowered it down. So I will have to remake this front brake line setup as well. So once everything is moved, I'll have to redo the front brake assembly or the front brake plumbing and get everything sorted. As for our mount on this side, it looks like the way, I remember how the mount was previously, this would have been too far back, whereas the other side is slightly too far forward. So it's a good thing that we had to remake this anyhow. Again, tight tolerances, just trying to figure out where everything fits. Around the bell housing, again, because the footwell is missing on this side of the car, for the dry sump assembly, we have more than enough room for maneuvering the engine and transmission into place. But when we look back here, if I can position the camera, so I pulled the reverse switch off and it is very tight on the chassis rail here. In fact, it was hitting the chassis rail and preventing us from rolling the transmission further back. So I don't know if I will need to remove this panel or this piece here, or bend this bar or cut it out or remove it somehow, or even just plug and use a different method to drive my reverse lights. It's just super, super tight here. So I'm not quite sure what we're going to do about it. There may be enough clearance once we roll the transmission over. So right now, the way the engine sits, it's kind of upright. Well, it needs to actually lean over to the passenger side a little bit. And when it does that, I think it'll open up more room on the reverse switch here. But in doing so, it's going to make the old PPF mount, the power plant frame mount on the transmission, even closer to the chassis over on this side. So I may have to clearance this guy on the transmission just to make room and verify that everything can move the way it needs to. Lastly, on this rear mount, it was a little bit tight getting it in, and you have to sort of start the nut and hold the washer up when you slide this mount in, because there's no way to get the nut on after the fact. And you can slide the drive shaft in from the bottom after the fact, so you don't have to have it already in place. So I think that's where we're at for now. We did remove the cooling pack, which is over here, in order to have enough room for the engine hoist and everything like that. I'll have to do a little bit of chassis modifications. It's not the end of the world, it's just more work than I was expecting, but that's how these things shake out. So I think that's going to do it for today. Again, we're going to have to do a little bit more modification. It's not the end of the world, but we're going to have to do additional steps to get this particular setup to work. You know, to reiterate, I don't blame MK for like the engine setup. It should work K20 to K24. There are slight differences. I am using different parts than their sort of recipe for the build, so that's on me. We'll get it sorted, get it back in the car, and try it again. That's how these go. Like, sometimes you got to build the car 3 or 4 times in order to get to a final complete build. So that being said, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.